So to those who are already here, welcome to Classical Mechanics 1. I hope I am audible. Can
Yes,
somebody? Okay.
Yes,
Okay, great. Yeah. Yeah, so it would be good if people are come about certainly by the starting time of 11:50. You are welcome 5 minutes in advance as well.
Sir, our previous lecture just ended like 2 minutes ago, so people are still joining.
Okay. All right, so that ended at 11:45, is it? Okay.
Yes, sir. Sir extended a little bit, so we left at 11:49 or something. So we're still joining.
Wow. Okay. Well, then you are excused. Okay. Perhaps you need a break then. Fine. And how many were you in your previous lecture?
Sir, about 65, 70.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So, and what was the previous lecture?
Analysis 1 by Rajiv Karandega, sir.
Okay. Analysis 1. Fine. Yeah. So we have 35 people right now. Yeah. Today we are going to just get started, and we're not really going to get into the heart of classical mechanics. I plan to do some a little bit of mathematical background, and also to bring us all on a common page. But I'm still waiting for people to join.
so at the end of the class, people were still asking some doubts, so that might be the reason why it's slightly difficult.
Okay. So we will need to make some allowance for that, or ensure that the previous class ends on time. Fine. Yeah, thanks for letting me know. So I presume many of you have learned some amount of classical mechanics or mechanics in school or during other courses. So there will be some things here which are very familiar. There will be things that sound familiar, but when you look at them in greater depth are not so familiar. There will be things that are quite new, I hope. Please bear that in mind while we go through things. Okay, we have 58 people and we are now 4-5 minutes into the class. Yeah. 65 to 70 is what I have to. Yes, please do have a copy and a pen. It's a good idea. I had a teacher once, a complex analysis teacher, David Prill. He told me that you learn through your fingers by writing also. You learn through your ears and eyes also by reading, but also by writing. So please do have a paper and pen. It's not like you have to write everything down, but there's no harm in writing some equations or even a question that you have, something that you had a doubt about to keep there perhaps. Yeah, I mean, it's a skill to know what and how much to write down. And by attending a lecture, you develop the skill. Yeah, 61. So while we still wait for others Let me continue with these generalities. Yeah, so I think you've all received my email, and there will be stuff posted both on Moodle as well as on the course website, whose link I have sent you. The course is largely defined by the lectures themselves, and there may be notes that I make available as well. So those would be what defines the course. There are books that one can consult as well, which I will suggest. One of them is by Klepner and Kolenkov on mechanics. It is available in Indian edition, Cambridge University Press, 2nd edition, at a discounted rate, an introduction to mechanics. So this is a nice book, and there are many other books as well. I will mention others as we go along. There's one by David Morin. There's books by in the Berkeley series by Kittel and about 4 or 5 other authors. There is the Feynman lectures in physics. So there are several sources, and but in addition to all of that, the main thing is the lecture itself, and the discussions we have. Do we need to have all the books you mentioned, sir, or just one of them? You don't need to have any of them. If you want to get just one of them, you can get perhaps the one by Klepner and Kolenkov. You don't need to have all of them, no. But you do need to attend the lectures and be involved and work out the problems that are assigned. That is quite important. If there is specific reading that I assign, then I will tell you where to look those things up. The books I have mentioned, I believe, are all available in Indian edition, relatively reasonably priced, if you would like to purchase any of them. Any other questions on general matters at this stage?
Sir, who are the TAs for the lecture?
Yeah, so today we have 2 of our graduate students helping us. One is Ankit, the other who is here as a co-host, as well as Pritish Sinha, joining us from Hazaribagh. Ankit is in Chennai. And there are additional TAs who are not present here, who will be involved with other lectures as well as perhaps tutorials, grading, and so on. I will introduce the other tutors. One is Advait Fadnis, and there is Vishnu Kadiri and Shubhendu Prasad Mandal. So we will be assisted by all of these people. Any other questions at this stage? We have 65 persons, students with us. That includes, I don't know, that includes me and the 2 TAs. So we really have only 62 students. Fine. Okay, but I think, these different books have different viewpoints. Some may be somewhat more phenomena oriented. Some may be more theoretically oriented. So some may give more background, some may give more problems. So it's but somebody joined and wanted me to repeat the reference books. Now tell me, if you join late, can you still see the text box, the chat box? Or is that invisible?
Yes, sir. If we join late, we can't see the previous messages, but we
Okay. So let me repeat some of that. One good book is the one by Klepner and Kolenkov. So I will, if you want to buy one, this is a nice one. On an introduction to mechanics, Cambridge University Press, 2nd edition. It's available in Indian edition, I think just short of 1,000 rupees. I also mentioned the book by David Morin. I also mentioned a book in the Berkeley Physics series by Kittel and other authors. So the one main message is to try to be here on time so that we don't have to repeat things. And then there are the Feynman lectures in physics, the first volume, which is a very a deep presentation of physics. So, and the list goes on. I think there's one by, there's one by Newton. In fact, there are several Newtons, but there is one by Isaac Newton. It's called the Principia, Principles of Natural Philosophy. At some point, you may want to look up something about that. Anyway, so jokes apart, the primary book for this course is the lecture. I will also try to provide some lecture notes, and they will define the course. It may be supplemented by these other books. You are, if you would like to buy one, I suggested the one by Klepner and Kolenkov. The others are also excellent ones. I will make a list of books and put them on the course website.